Imagine two people entering the same negotiation. One of them needs the deal. The other one does not. Before a single word is spoken, the outcome is already decided. This is what Machiavelli called detachment. Not coldness, not technique. The structural condition of someone who can walk away. Not because of intelligence or preparation, or the quality of the offer, because of leverage. And leverage, in any human interaction, belongs almost entirely to the person who needs the outcome less. You have felt this in a job interview where you already had another offer, and your ease surprised even you. How much better you spoke, how much less you stumbled, how clearly you could hear what was being asked. In a conversation with someone you admired where the wanting made you worse, where the need to be liked tightened something in your chest, and the conversation you could have had was replaced by the performance of a conversation. You have felt the difference between needing an outcome and not needing it. And you know instinctively which version of you the world responds to. Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, chapter 17, that it is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. This is one of his most quoted lines and one of his most misread ones. Most people hear it as a call to be cold, to cultivate menace, to suppress warmth, to frighten rather than connect. But that is not what he was describing. He was describing a structural reality about dependence. The prince who needs the people's love is controlled by it. The prince who has built his position on something more durable than their affection can afford to be just, even when justice is unpopular, because his security does not depend on their approval in any given moment. The argument is not about coldness. It is about what happens when you have removed your dependence on a particular outcome. What Machiavelli was describing, though he never used the word, was detachment. Not as a performance, not as a technique, but as a structural condition. And what that condition produces is this: you become, in the deepest sense, free to act. By the end of this, you will understand what neediness actually costs you, not morally, but mechanically. You will understand why detachment cannot be performed, only earned, and you will encounter the distinction that Machiavelli drew, and that most modern readings of him miss entirely, between the person who appears independent and the person who actually is. They are not the same, and only one of them holds genuine power. Part 1. The cost of need. Every negotiation is decided by the same question: who needs this more? Need is the most exploitable human quality, not because people are predatory, though some are, but because need broadcasts itself. The person who needs the outcome reveals that need in 100 subtle ways before the negotiation has properly begun. They over-explain. They seek confirmation they are being heard. They watch the other person's face too carefully. They adjust their position slightly when they sense resistance. They fill silences that should be left open. And the person across from them, consciously or not, reads every one of these signals and understands, this person cannot walk away, which means I can offer less. This is not a theory of human cruelty. It is a structural feature of exchange. In any transaction, a salary negotiation, a romantic overture, a social dynamic, the party with more alternatives has more leverage. The party with fewer alternatives has less. And the person who cannot walk away has effectively no leverage at all, regardless of how strong their underlying position might be. Their need has already priced them out of their own negotiation. Machiavelli understood this through decades of watching Florentine politics operate. He watched princes lose alliances, not because their position was weak, but because their desperation to maintain those alliances was visible. And visible desperation is an invitation to extract. He watched rulers who needed loyalty from a particular lord give that lord more than the relationship was worth. because the Lord knew the alternative was worse for the prince than for himself. Need made visible becomes a subsidy the needy person pays without realizing they are paying it. In personal relationships, this operates with equal precision. The person who needs the relationship more will eventually accommodate behaviors that erode them, not because they are weak, but because the alternative of losing the relationship is to them worse than the cost of accommodation. Each accommodation slightly shifts the terms. Each shift teaches the other person what is possible. Over time, the person who needed the relationship less has renegotiated its terms entirely, without ever having an explicit conversation about it, simply by allowing the other person's need to do the work. This is not a cynical observation about human nature. It is a description of a gravitational force. Need creates a pull toward accommodation. The person with less need applies less force in the direction of the relationship's center, and so the center moves toward them. It is not always intentional, but it is always operating, and the person who understands it is in a radically different position from the person who does not. This is not always cynically intentional. Often, it is simply human nature operating on its own logic. People expand into the space available to them, and where need creates space, they will fill it. The cost of this is not dramatic. It does not arrive all at once. It arrives as a series of small compromises that individually feel reasonable and collectively produce a position you would never have agreed to if it had been presented whole. What changes when you genuinely do not need the outcome? The accommodation pressure disappears. Not because you become hard or distant, but because the mechanism by which your position gets eroded no longer has a fulcrum to operate on. You can engage fully, warmly, openly, and simultaneously hold a position. Because holding the position does not cost you the thing you cannot afford to lose. You have more than one path. You can walk. The skeleton in the thumbnail is not cold. It is not performing menace or withholding warmth as a tactic. It is simply not in need. And that quality, genuine, earned, structural non-need, is what the image communicates. It is not an attitude, it is a condition. And conditions are not performed, they are arrived at. Part 2. The performance problem. You can act detached, but the body keeps the score, and people read the body. Here is where most of what is written about detachment goes wrong. The advice is usually, act as if you do not care. Do not text back immediately. Withhold your attention strategically. Create mystery by being unavailable. These are techniques, and they fail in a specific, predictable way. They fail because the person performing them still needs the outcome. The need is still there. They are simply managing its expression. And the management of unexpressed need produces a particular quality of tension that is unmistakable to anyone paying attention. You can call it what you like. Something feels off. Something is slightly too deliberate, but it registers. The person who is strategically withholding their text is not relaxed. They are watching the phone. The person who is performing unavailability is available in their mind every moment they are absent. The person who is acting unbothered is bothered by their own performance. And this tension, this gap between the feeling and the presentation, is what people feel when they say something is off about a person, without being able to articulate exactly what. Machiavelli was precise about this. In chapter 18 of The Prince, he wrote that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. The surface is what most people evaluate, but surfaces are not foolproof. The surface of performed detachment is distinguishable from the surface of genuine detachment to anyone who looks carefully. Genuine detachment has a quality of ease that performance cannot replicate. because ease is the byproduct of actually not needing the thing. And you cannot manufacture the byproduct without the underlying state. I want to say something here directly, because this is where I think most of the self-help content around Machiavelli misses the point in a way that actively harms the people consuming it. I spent a period of my own life trying to practice detachment as a technique, studying the advice, deploying the strategic silences, cultivating the appearance of someone who did not need what I plainly still needed. And what it produced was not power. It produced a kind of exhausting vigilance, a constant management of my own presentation that was more draining than simple transparency would have been. I was performing non-need while being consumed by need. And the performance made everything worse because it added the burden of maintaining an image to the already existing burden of wanting something I could not yet hold lightly. If this kind of thinking is useful to you, the ideas that don't get softened, the ones that actually ask something of you, subscribe to Wise Daily. That's what we're here for. The performance problem is not a character failure. It is a category error. Most people who seek detachment as a technique are actually seeking an outcome. They want to be more attractive, more powerful, more respected. And they are trying to achieve that outcome through the simulation of a state that would produce it. But the state cannot be simulated. And the simulation, being detectable, often produces the opposite of the intended effect. The person you are trying to attract or impress reads the effort behind the performance, which communicates the need you were trying to conceal. The gap between what you are presenting and what you are feeling is a form of information, and people receive it. The alternative is not to perform detachment. It is to build the conditions under which genuine detachment becomes available to you, which requires understanding what those conditions actually are, and accepting that they are internal, not tactical. The work is not in how you present. It is in what you actually become capable of releasing. Part 3. The Prince and Fortune. Machiavelli's deepest analysis of independence appears not in his discussion of cruelty or cunning, but in chapter 25 of The Prince, where he addresses fortune, the role of circumstance and luck in human affairs. He argued that fortune controls roughly half of what happens to us, and the other half is within our power to shape. His metaphor was a violent river. When it floods, it destroys everything in its path. But when people have built embankments in the calm periods, when they have prepared, the river does less damage. The preparation does not control the flood, but it changes the relationship between the person and the flood. This is the structural argument beneath the detachment principle. The person who has built their embankments, who has developed genuine alternatives, genuine self-sufficiency, genuine internal resources, is in a different position when fortune turns against them than the person who has not. They are not destroyed by the outcome because they are not wholly dependent on it. They have, in Machiavelli's terms, reduced the leverage that fortune holds over them. The distinction he was drawing, and this is the one that the popular readings almost always miss, is between the prince who has built genuine independence and the prince who merely performs it. The genuinely independent prince has alliances, resources, institutions, a record of conduct that secures his position regardless of whether any particular person loves him today. His non-dependence on any single source of support is structural. He's not pretending to need less than he needs. He actually needs less than the prince who has built his position on the affection of a volatile public. The performed version, the prince who pretends not to need the people's love while actually depending on it entirely, is catastrophically vulnerable. When the performance fails, when the public turns, there is nothing underneath to hold the position. The appearance of independence was never supported by its substance, and appearance without substance Machiavelli observed with his characteristic bluntness, is the most fragile political position possible. The person who performs detachment is still owned by the outcome they are pretending not to want. The person who has built genuine alternatives has actually removed the leverage the outcome holds. Say, the person who has done the internal work, who has developed a relationship with themselves that does not require external validation, has arrived at something performance cannot reach. 3 tests then, for whether what you are practicing is genuine detachment or its surface performance. First, when the outcome you claim not to need is taken away, do you feel relief or devastation? Genuine detachment produces some version of the former. Performance produces the latter, and the devastation is proportional to the actual size of the hidden need. Second, does your behavior change significantly depending on whether you are being observed? The genuinely detached person behaves consistently in private and in public because their behavior is not a presentation to an audience. The performer is always aware of the audience and adjusts accordingly. Third, can you genuinely celebrate an outcome you did not receive going to someone else? Not performatively, not as a display of magnanimity, but actually. Genuine non-attachment to an outcome includes genuine non-attachment to who receives it. These are not comfortable tests. Most people who believe they are practicing detachment will find, in these moments, that they were practicing its surface, which is useful information because knowing where you actually are is the beginning of arriving at where you want to be. The gap between performed detachment and the genuine state is not a character failure. It is a starting point. It tells you exactly how much work remains and in which direction, inward, always inward, the work needs to go. Part 4, the inward path. The path to genuine detachment runs inward, not outward. This is the thing the tactical advice never says, because tactical advice by definition is directed at the surface, at the presentation, at the management of how you appear. And what genuine detachment requires cannot be achieved at the surface. It requires changes to the underlying structure. 3 things build genuine detachment, and none of them are strategic. The first is alternatives. The person who needs a specific relationship, a specific job, a specific person's approval, needs it because they have nothing else. The most direct path to needing any single thing less is to have more. More genuine connections, more developed skills, more directions in which a life can move. This is not emotional coldness. It is the practical architecture of freedom. Every alternative you build is a reduction in the leverage any single outcome holds over you. Machiavelli spent his exile building his writing, his intellectual correspondence, his private scholarship, not as a performance of indifference to the political career he had lost, but because having something worth doing makes the absence of something else genuinely less catastrophic. The second is self-knowledge. The person who does not know their own needs is at their mercy. They do not know which outcomes they actually need and which they merely want. They cannot distinguish between the loss that matters and the loss that does not. And so they treat every potential loss as catastrophic, which produces a generalized neediness, a constant low-level desperation that is detectable in everything they do. Self-knowledge is the ability to look at a potential loss and know accurately what it will actually cost you. Often it costs less than the fear suggested. The loss of approval from a specific person, the loss of a specific position, the loss of a specific relationship. Once clearly examined, these are often manageable. The fear of them is frequently larger than the reality. Self-knowledge reduces the fear to its actual dimensions. The third is practice. Not the practice of performing detachment, but the practice of sitting with discomfort without acting on it. The practice of feeling the pull to explain, to apologize, to seek reassurance and not acting on it in that moment. Not because acting on it would be wrong, but because the practice of sitting with the feeling, of discovering that you can tolerate it, builds a genuine relationship with your own emotional states. Over time, this produces something that feels like equanimity, not the suppression of feeling, but the capacity to experience feeling without being governed by it. This is what the skeleton in the thumbnail embodies, not the absence of depth, but its presence and the mastery of it. You cannot perform sovereignty. You can only become it. You cannot perform sovereignty. You can only become it. The skeleton in the armchair is not cold. It is complete. Not in the sense of having nothing left to want, but in the sense of having enough alternatives, enough self-knowledge, enough practice sitting with discomfort, that the outcome of any particular interaction does not threaten the foundation it sits on. Machiavelli was not teaching cruelty or manipulation. He was describing the mechanics of genuine freedom, the conditions under which a person or a prince is free to act according to their actual values rather than being bent by the leverage that need creates. That freedom is not a personality trait. It is built, and it is built inward, not by the management of appearances. You cannot perform sovereignty. You can only become it. Where in your life is your need showing more than you intend? If that question landed, type "I earn my ease" in the comments, not for me, but for you. And if this video gave you something real, please like it, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Wise Daily. Every video on this channel is built to give you one thing: the philosophical tools to live with more power, more clarity, and more intention. We'll see you in the next one. Machiavelli showed us that genuine independence is built, not performed, that the freedom to act without being bent by need requires internal architecture, not external technique. But there is a philosopher who spent his life examining exactly what that architecture looks like from the inside, what it requires of you moment to moment in the specific circumstances of a life you did not fully choose. That philosopher is Marcus Aurelius, and what he discovered, writing alone at the edge of an empire in the middle of a war, is the subject of our next video.